Welcome back to episode 3. I'm going to make a little bit of a shorter video here where I'm just going to kind of give an overview of the more meta matchups that we're going to be seeing in the upcoming ProQuest season. I didn't have time to get through all the other videos that I wanted to do, so I want to kind of get a baseline out there for just so it's there for the first week of ProQuest season. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with the one that I've already done a video on, but the goal is to have all of the information in one video. So we're going to dive right into Oldhim. I'm going to give each of the deck or the matchups kind of a rating on how difficult, or rather how good or bad the matchup is, and also how difficult the matchup is. Note when I say difficult, it's not like the difficulty of winning, but I'm talking about the difficulty of navigating the matchup properly. So a more difficult matchup would be something that you'd want to put more testing into, or something, and there's a lot more intricacies to it. Something with a lower rating would be much more simple and probably doesn't need you as much time dedicated to practicing it. So going from there, first matchup is Oldhim. This matchup, I would say, is probably our second worst matchup. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10 as how good of the matchup it is. It's pretty bad. And then as far as difficulty, I think this one's like an 8 or a 9. Oldhim is a very complicated matchup in how you pace the game, how you manage your resources, how you manage your pitch stack, what you block with, knowing your threats in deck, understanding. There's just a lot of small things that go into it. And these games are often going to come down to a couple of points of health. So there are going to be a lot of games that are within reach if played perfectly. However, any mistakes that you have there are going to make it harder and harder to win. So it's definitely one that is very tedious to practice because, again, you're running through your full 71 cards. You're going to get fatigued a lot of times. But it's one that you're going to learn a lot from. So that's kind of where I put it as difficulty. As far as how we approach the matchup, it's going to be kind of on a sliding scale. You're going to kind of default to a mid-range game plan because, again, Oldhim can play aggressive, he can play mid-range into it. But then we're also looking for opportunities to push through damage and maybe take some lines that might not be as efficient on the amount of damage threatened, but will actually present damage or dominate damage through in order to force damage. Because the main ways you're going to deal damage to Oldhim will be either going very wide to where they have to leak damage, or going tall enough with Dominate that they can't block it out. And both of those ways often are amplified by being able to keep your opponent off of an arsenal on the previous turn, or they take damage trying to keep an arsenal. So that's kind of the overview of how we're going to push through damage. For a lot of the turn cycles, you're not going to have that option of going, hey, I'm going to have a 17, 18, 19 damage turn, or you're not going to have the option of going 11 Dominate. So on those turn cycles, you're looking for just wide enough or tall enough to threaten them and make them block so they can't crack back without taking damage. So even if that's something as simple as red in the ledger for 8, that's a threat that your opponent has to at least block partially. The most they can do after blocking that out would be like a CNC. And actually, if they block out the 8, they probably either leaked something on the attack, or that CNC is denying them their own arsenal. So kind of your baseline, you want to be threatening like 8 at a minimum on your turns, just so that they have the choice of leaking damage, or they either leak damage or they can't present something back like a Spinal Crush or a CNC Pummel. Obviously, you want to be able to go taller when possible, but you want to try and string together multiple turns in a row that are taller than that. So whether that's in the form of you take a wide, like 15 damage turn, to where they're presented the option of either leaking damage or blocking with all 5 cards and losing their arsenal, or losing their ability to arsenal on the following turn. So if you can go 15 and then arsenal and come in with a 5-card hand against their 4-card hand, you put them in that same position where you threaten 11, they either give up their ability to arsenal again to block it out, or they're leaking damage. And that's where you'll start to get these points through. But all of that is kind of built up to by having these just middling turns of 8 damage here, this 4 into 5, this 5 into 5. These things that are going to chip in 1 and 2s, or have them leak damage to try and crack back, or just they throw their entire hand, which then gives you the ability to play a 5-card hand because they didn't disrupt you at all. So yeah, you're kind of bouncing back and forth between those, and then when you get in that position where you get to come into a 5-card hand uninterrupted, or only interrupted by like a frostbite, that's when you're looking for these either dominates or very tall wide turns. Now, throughout all of this, there are going to be turn cycles where Oldhim goes, I'm going to take a little bit of damage and come back with like a Spinal. And that's where it becomes difficult to evaluate what cards you need to block with. Because obviously, hey, it's a Spinal. I don't want to block a Spinal. Or rather, I do want to block a Spinal because I can't play underneath it. But sometimes you'll be looking at a hand and you'll go, either this doesn't block it efficiently. If I have a hand where it's like a yellow Glide Path, a red in the Ledger, a Release the Tension, and a Seek and Destroy, it's like, well, this doesn't block Spinal well. So now what am I throwing in front of it? Because you have to throw something in front because you need to keep your health total. But you have to be able to decide between either cracking back some or maintaining threat density. So that would be something where it's like, yeah, I mean, it's just a difficult decision at that point, what you want to block with. In that case, I would probably block with like, probably Red in the Ledger, Release the Tension, and then assuming nothing in Arsenal, I would just pitch away. Actually, no, it would be Glide and Red in the Ledger I'd block with. Pitch away the pitch away the Seek and Destroy Arsenal to Release the Tension. Because Seek and Destroy is a very key part that you want to have on a 5-card hand to threaten that on hit, to try and keep that momentum going. In this case, you would be on the back foot because you're letting them come in with a 5-card hand. So you just push it away for later, for when you actually have tempo. You might be tempted to maybe throw 7 in front, but blocking with one of these buffs would mean, sure, you take 2 less damage, but you're taking it out of your deck. And I guess that actually ends up being situational. It comes down to what their health total is, what your health total is. Can you afford to give up 2 health? Can you afford to lose a card? And if it's like they're on 10 and you're at 20, and you have, only 15 cards in deck, you probably need to take that extra damage in order to save that Seek and Destroy. If you're both at 10 and you have 20 cards in deck, you probably need to put the Seek and Destroy in front of the attack. So it's all these little decision points that there isn't a clear like formula where you know the exact correct answer. A lot of it comes down to feel and just repetition. The more you play the matchup, the more you understand what the contents of your deck are able to actually threaten through a standard Oldhim defending and blocking out. And then when you know what you're able to do with the remaining cards in your deck, you know what cards are expendable and what cards aren't, and you understand how much they can threaten you and how much of your health you can give away for different things like that. So that's why I think it's probably our most difficult matchup as far as complexity, because there are all these minuscule points that difference between, do I take 2 damage or do I give up my Seek and Destroy? Like, that decision point could be the difference between the game, or between winning and losing the game. And one could be the winning line and one could be the losing line, and it could be flipped depending on the game state. So enough talking about all of that stuff. You're going to expect to see a Rampart. I think it's pretty common knowledge at this point that Stalagmite is not the play into Azalea. I think you can still lose to Stalagmite. I would just say that you're much more comfortable into a Stalagmite, because against Stalagmite, they have more difficulty blocking breakpoints, and they're forced more onto a mid-range plan. They can't pitch to Crown every turn. They're just playing a tempo game, which means if they ever stumble, they're leaking damage. It's possible they just do Bravo things and just swing huge attacks and pummels and spinals, but more than likely they're going to stumble, and you're going to have, I think it's going to be a slight favor. I don't think it's a massive favorite, but I would say it's a favorable matchup for Azalea if they present this Stalagmite. So assuming it's the Rampart, early on in the game, you're going to want to be looking to find a drill shot. If you get the opportunity early on to knock drill shot, come in for like 10 dominate, 10 actually might not hit because it'll typically have 3 armor, 4 with the Rampart. Crown is 5, Earth React. 10's probably about the lowest you can go. Ideally, you can get it up to like 13, and that should usually hit. But when you are able to hit the Rampart, it now puts you in a position where you have a lot more flexibility on breaking the combat chain, and it also makes it a lot harder for your opponent to block breakpoints. So while they have Rampart out, things like Ravenous Rebel and E-Strike need to be timed very carefully. You can't just go like a standard line where you'd pitch a yellow, load an arrow. Ravenous Rebel see another arrow on top and dominate the new arrow on top, because if they block with Rampart, all of a sudden, using Azalea's ability to gain Dominate is now losing essentially 2 damage, because typically they'll have a floating resource, it'll break the chain, and they get to block with the Rampart for 2 with that resource they weren't going to use anyways. So all of a sudden, that Dominate keyword is losing you 2 damage. However, once the Rampart's gone, most of the time they won't be blocking with the Rampart on the first chain link, because they'd pay 1 to do nothing. If they do, you may consider still using the Dominate because you're only losing 1 there, but essentially they are getting a lot less out of it. Or if you don't dominate, they just spent a resource to do nothing. So your flexibility to use things like Ravenous Rebel and E-Strike and Bolton shots and Bullseye Bracers gets a lot more open once the Rampart's gone. Obviously, you're not going to be able to get rid of it every time. There's also going to be games where they're down to like 15 and you have the option of going for a drill shot, and it might not actually be worth it at that point anymore. When you're at like a third of your deck left, it's probably too late to go out of your way to set up that drill shot, because oftentimes that's going to involve using like a Knock the Death Whistle to fire it. So I wouldn't go too out of your way to get one as the game gets later, but if you can land one early on, it's going to make things a bit easier. Seek and Destroy, as I mentioned, very important for if you can find a Dominate, you want it. Let me rephrase that. If you fire a Seek and Destroy, you want to dominate it or have it have a good chance of hitting whenever possible. Or make them use their entire hand to block it, because that essentially does the same thing of denying the arsenal. If you're going to have a middling turn where you're just firing like 8 not dominated, you typically don't want to use the Seek and Destroy for that. So occasionally you'll need to take a slightly less efficient line in order to save that Seek and Destroy in deck. So something like if you had a yellow Glide Path, a red in the Ledger, and a Seek and Destroy, no arsenal, and your Tunic's up, there's an argument to like Tunic the red in the Ledger, play the Glide Path, don't find an arrow on top, and just go, I'm going to pitch the Seek and Destroy to fire the red in the Ledger, arsenal the other card, and move on with my day. Obviously, if you find an arrow on top, you could dominate and fire it for 10 dominate using the Seek and Destroy, losing your own arsenal, but something like that, where if you're just going to come in with a middling attack for like 8, it's probably not worth using the Seek and Destroy, unless tempo dictates it. So if you're like even on health and you don't have that margin to play inefficiently, you may have to do it anyways. But ideally, when presented the option, you want to save Seek and Destroys for your bigger turns because it can snowball your pressure. That's that. The Perch Grapplers, if they're trying to be super defensive, don't be afraid to look for a Perch Grapplers line, especially if you've broken their Rampart and they haven't been able to pressure you back for these Perch Grapplers. You can look for something like a Rain Razors into, or like break Perch Grapplers, Arrow from Arsenal, Rain Razors, pitch another blue, load an arrow, fire it, bracers, fire another one, and you would be costing 2 blues, and you'd be looking at like 22 damage, 23, 24, something like that. That is an option if you're ever presented with a hand like that. It might look awkward where you've got like a red in the ledger, an arsenal, a headshot, another red in the ledger, and a rain razors or something. And then you gotta just look at the top. Or no, like 2 headshots, red in hand, red in arsenal, rain razors in hand, and you up the top and see another arrow and go, okay, that's a hand where I can take this line. Obviously, if they have Rampart up still, it becomes a lot worse, but it's still something to consider. Yeah, I think that's the biggest one. Be cognizant, especially during the end game. It's hard across the whole game to keep track of your stack because unlike a lot of decks where it's just you're only paying attention to what goes to the bottom at the end of your turn, in Azalea you have to be paying attention to what you put at the bottom at the end of your turn, what you opt to the bottom, and what you Azalea to the bottom, what you E-strike to the bottom, what you sink to the bottom. Like, there's a ton of things that are going to the bottom at all different points during turns, and it can be difficult to track it. However, when you get down to the last like 10 cards, you really got to try and pay attention and know what's in there. Because if you know the exact order of your cards, it's very, very powerful tool in order to be able to plan out in advance. I'm still bad at that. Even when I'm down to like 5 cards, sometimes I don't know it, and that's kind of frustrating for me because I should know it at this point, but it's definitely something that is going to be a very valuable tool in this matchup and gives you a pretty decent edge over other Azalea players in the matchup. That was not at all fast. I was planning on getting through this faster, but that's Oldhim. And again, it's one of the more complicated matchups, so I feel like there was a lot more to say there. The next one is Phi, which I don't think is a crazy favored matchup. It honestly might be closer to a 50-50. I'm going to say it's like a 55 Azalea favor, but it's a tough matchup. Or it's scary, at least. Sometimes the games only go for 3 or 4 turns, maybe 5. And if you don't find your disruption, you don't find your disruption. And you're going to have a bad time. That said, I would probably rate it as like a 6 out of 10 matchup. Maybe. As far as how good the matchup is. And then on difficulty, it's probably only like a 3 or a 4. The matchup is pretty straightforward. You kind of have to go with what your hand gives you. And this is a matchup where we're playing very aggressive. So you might think that they're the aggressor, you want to be defensive, block, and disrupt, but Phi, you can't really block out Phi. It's just not really a thing. Even Oldhim has recognized that you can't block out Phi, and so Oldhims are playing aggressive into Phi. Bravo plays fully aggressive into Phi. Like, all these other decks with disruptive tools and the ability to block have all said, blocking doesn't work against Phi. You have to disrupt him and be aggressive and try and race him. And the thing is, we don't block as well as those Guardians. So it's kind of a no-brainer when you look at it that way, that this is a matchup where you need to be aggressive. You're looking to trade damage and present on hits whenever possible. But primarily presenting just raw damage is another great way of progressing the game state. As soon as he gets down to low health and has to start blocking, you're in a really good position. So you kind of need to get him to that point. That's the hard part, is getting him to that point without him killing you, I guess, would be the easiest way to phrase that. Yeah, I think that's about it. You kind of just run at him. Pretty much standard playing against Fi stuff applies in the form of if he's got Mask of Momentum, don't let him draw off Mask of Momentum. But other than that, it's pretty aggressive. You really, unless your hand doesn't do anything else, like if it just blocks, you can block. But for the most part, you kind of just want to run at him. Yeah, try and get that all you got value when you can. But I think it's a pretty straightforward matchup. I think kind of the hardest part would be recognizing that you do need to race. That's something that could be missed early on, where you think that, hey, this Azalea deck can play mid-range, so just play mid-range. The problem is mid-range doesn't work into Fi. Fi runs over anything playing mid-range into him. Which is why you see even like Reinhar's have to play full aggro to try and beat Fi, or they have a hard time because Reinhar's a mid-range deck. And those other decks, the Oldhams, the Bravos, they all have to play aggressive into Fi. Don't underestimate Remorseless. This card is really good in the matchup. I had someone have an Art of War turn against me where they played 6 cards under Remorseless. And so when you look back at it, my Remorseless ended up being actually, I had a buff on it. So I used 2 cards to fire for 8, and then it did 6 more. So it was 2 cards for 14. Very good. Very good rate against Fi. Don't underestimate how good this card is. It is... Honestly, when they decide to play through it, it might actually be better than Red in the Ledger in some situations. Obviously not always, but like it makes their cards so inefficient. Like there are times where they probably should just be blocking it out and going slow because this does so much damage. Very, very powerful card. Yeah, I think that's all I got for Fi. Fi is, like I said, a pretty straightforward matchup. Race him, be efficient, and yeah, hope the cards line up. Next one I've got is Icelander. Icelander is an interesting one because this is one where I've found a lot of success. However, the kind of general Azalea stats on February have shown that it's not a great matchup, or at least that's what it appears to be. Whereas I've felt that it's a quite good matchup. I've gotten the opportunity to play against some very good Icelander players, and the matchup has still felt good. It's not amazing, but on average, across all the like high caliber Icelander players that I've played against, I've still taken a majority of the games, not by much, but a slight majority. Which is, yeah, I think it's a good matchup for Azalea, and it's confusing because on paper it shouldn't be, because we shouldn't be able to deal with frostbites, but I think when you approach the matchup properly, it's really hard for Icelander to deal with your raw aggression. So yeah, going into it, I've got it as a rating of a 6 out of 10. I want to call it a better matchup than Fi. Like, I'm actually more afraid of Fi because Icelander games go longer, so 1 brick turn doesn't ruin the game. Whereas against Fi, if you brick for 1 turn, you can just die. So I feel like I have more agency in the matchup than I do against Fi. So I'm going to say it's a better matchup. It might even be a 7 out of 10. It feels quite good. But it's tough to gauge exactly. It's somewhere in that range. As far as difficulty, I'd probably put it around a 6. It's not too crazy because it is pretty straightforward once you get kind of like the key points about the matchup. Once you understand those, it's not too bad, but a lot of it also does come down to understanding how Iyslander works. So if you have an understanding of what Iyslander is trying to do and what ways Iyslander can disrupt you, and you're able to, and if you play around those, you are in a pretty good position. So this is another matchup where we're going to be very aggressive. We can't really afford to be blocking Arcane, especially on their turn. If it's the Icelander's turn, you can't afford to block Arcane. We only have AB2. Even if we had AB3, I wouldn't want to give them a blue. But right now, we'd be giving away 1 card to block 2 damage. And it's just very underrate. Against like the Wounded Bulls and the Fighting Spirits and Scars, there's a debate to throw cards in front there. But you really need to be very card efficient. I think one of the easy traps to fall into is using your blues to block Arcane, especially on the Aether Ice Veins. I know when that card, or I guess the card is still popular, but there was a time where people were saying, hey, you get Aether Ice Veined, you pitch a blue, you AB1, and then you pay with the remaining 2, and all of a sudden you used 1 card and reduced the damage by 1 as opposed to just like paying or discarding. So like it becomes more card efficient. You're losing 1 card and taking 1 less damage as opposed to just using 1 card. And that sounds great on paper until you put it in the perspective of playing a deck that only has 9 blues in it. We need our blues to play through the Icelander's disruption. If you give away your blue to save 1 health over giving away a red, like discarding the red, all of a sudden you leave yourself very open to being blown out by frostbites, by blizzards, by Channel Lake Frigids. And those cards are often going to cost you an entire extra card or more to play your turn. So take the 1 extra damage, discard a red to your Aether Ice Vein, hold your blue, use your blue to push back. So I guess the kind of biggest key principle in this matchup is, obviously there are some exceptions, but against Iyslander, blues are there for playing through their tax effects, not for paying for Arcane Barrier. And once you kind of understand that and approach it in that perspective, all of a sudden you discard your red on that Aether Ice Vein, and then you go to play your turn, they give you a frostbite, and you just laugh, like, okay, I got a spare resource because I have a blue. And they can't slow you down. Not as effectively. There's definitely some discussion as to what combination of Blizzard and Hypothermia people play into us. I'm of the opinion that Hypothermia should not be played against Azalea. It only hits E-Strike and Bolt and Shot, and the issue is that they would have to sit on it in Arsenal multiple turns oftentimes, waiting for us to play one of those. However, you do need to kind of be under the assumption that it is a possibility. And E-Strike is probably the one that you would get punished the hardest on. However, on Bolt and Shots, typically you're just going to want to play all of your buffs and then your Bolt and Shot, just in case there's a Blizzard, just in case there's a Hypothermia. You don't want to play something like, I don't know, let's just say you had Take Aim, Red in the Ledger, Read the Glide Path, Release the Tension in hand, and a Bolt and Shot in Arsenal. You play normally against a lot of decks, I would play like 1 buff and then fire the Bolt and Shot. And then you'd pitch, load, and play the 2nd buff, fire the 2nd arrow. Against Iyslander, just play all of the buffs, fire the Bolt and Shot. If it gets taxed out, fine. You still presented that largest number up at the front to make them do something. If you see 1 Hypothermia in a game, pitched or played or blocked or anything, if you see it at all, be aware that there's more. Because most of the time you don't care about Hypothermia, but there are a handful of turns where you do, and it's going to feel real bad if they have it. So I play under the assumption that it's not there, because it shouldn't be, and it would be clunky against us. But yeah, it could be scary. Blizzard, on the other hand, I was on the fence. I didn't think so originally. The more I've played the matchup, I think Blizzard is good into us. Being able to hit Rabble, Bolt and Shot, and E-Strike and not have to be taking up your arsenal slot. It's very, very effective, because oftentimes it's going to pull 2 cards out of our hand. So that's another one that you do need to be aware of is, am I going to get blown out by a Blizzard when I play this Rabble or an E-Strike or a Bolt and Shot? So just be cognizant of it. There's some level of being aware of it and some level of playing around it, but there are hands where you can't play around it, and sometimes you have to make them have it. But overall, goal is a lot of damage. If you can, you want to connect Seek and Destroy. It's the most powerful card in the matchup. As far as arrows, I think Headshot might be our best arrow. Unironically, Headshot might be the best arrow in this matchup, because Fatigue Shot, it can do something. Oftentimes it won't. Red in the Ledger basically does nothing. Sleep Dart does nothing. Actually, we have Sleep Dart out. Remorseless can stop Arsenal, but oftentimes it's doing the same amount as Headshot at best. Bolt and Shot can get taxed out or blizzarded and stuff, so it's really just Headshot is a big number good. But then, yeah, the most important card in the matchup is the Seek and Destroy, because if you're able to connect a Seek and Destroy, that means they don't have an arsenal going into the next turn, which means you can safely play out your line with the only possible tax being Striders or Blizzard. And there's only 3 Blizzards, but the Striders, they probably shouldn't be using. So for the most part, most of those turns after connecting a Seek and Destroy will go entirely untaxed, and then you can be a little less conservative about it. The other thing is, they need to be able to get their arsenal again, so they're only comfortable blocking with 3 cards at that point. And they've got a lot of 2 blocks. So it's very easy to leak damage after a Seek and Destroy, because they're going to have to take a bunch of damage to try and regain an arsenal. So very, very important to have Seek and Destroy. Snapdragons and Bracers, you are going to be looking for a big Rain Razor's turn. Again, Icelander does not block very well. She does not have equipment. It's really disruption, or it's really just the disruption that she has. If you're able to connect a Seek and Destroy, and then follow up with a big Rain Razors, snaps, even Bracers if needed, turn afterwards, it's very easy to just overwhelm her. The other big card in the matchup on her side is Channel Lake Frigid. We don't deal well with Channel Lake Frigid. Oftentimes it feels like the matchup comes down to how many turns of Channel Lake Frigid they can have. If they can get it to 5 total turns of Channel Lake Frigid or more is when it's rough. If it's 3 or less, I think we're in a pretty good spot. 4 is probably on the edge, but if they resolve 2 Channel Lake Frigids and keep them both for 3 turns, you're going to have a bad time. It's probably not going to go well. However, when Channel Lake Frigid is going to come down, you can't really avoid it. The way we deal with it is going to be attempt at Arsenal 1 for 5 arrows, Arsenal and E-Strike, something like that, and then it's just going to be the 1 action during the turn. You might be able to get spicy with arsenaling an arrow and pitching a blue, or arsenaling an E-Strike, pitching a blue to go Rabble into E-Strike. But you want to threaten something to make it so they have to choose between leaking damage or keeping Channel Lake Frigid. Would be the goal. Icelander, actually, I think one of the reasons why the matchup feels pretty good is that Icelander does not like breakpoints. So she's going to leak damage. She wants to leak damage. And these These effects like Fatigue Shot aren't crazy, or Remorseless aren't crazy, but they're good enough. And same, I guess Seek and Destroy is probably the biggest one. Icelander does not like breakpoints because she doesn't have a lot of armor. So against something that has like a crush effect, like a Bravo, she can do much better because she can block. She has a range that she can block and leak a couple points, but not get hit by the crush effect. Whereas something like Seek and Destroy, she'll often get put in a position where she's got to overblock in order to do that. Or she has 2 blocks and can't block effectively. So there's partly that, partly drawing cards adds to the power there. But overall, it's a matchup that you just need to be careful of what cards can punish you and be cognizant of that, but also don't be too afraid to take some risks on some lines and make her have it. Because if the game goes too long, she is going to chip you away. That's what Icelander wants to do, is she wants to trade and lower your both players' health. We need to just make sure her health goes down a lot faster than ours. Oh, also, as it gets to the end game against Icelander, say you're at like 10 or something, you can't afford to drag the game out. And so you can't go, oh, I'll play around them having like the Scolding and Arsenal, the Waning Moon, and the Strider's spell. Like, you can't afford to hold the damage there. You need to make them have it, because the longer that like small hand playing back and forth goes, the more you're going to get chipped away because you can't full block. You have to be ready to extend and make them have it. And the nice thing is, a lot of Icelanders these days are playing the Wounded Bulls and all that, and they often don't have it. There's a lot less Striders targets now than there used to be. So it's pretty common for Icelander not to have it. So don't be afraid when you're on like 8 health to go, screw it, I'm going to commit my entire hand and dominate an arrow and make you kill me. Or make you either kill me or die. And you're going to lose some games that way. You're also going to win a lot of games that way. So I think that's basically it for Icelander. Yeah. The takeaway is use your blues to play through disruption. Ignore almost all of her arcane damage. Outside of situations where you have like excess blues on your turn and they fire arcane at you, you know you can play through the frostbite they presented, and you go, hey, I'm going to have 1 extra resource. I can throw that into Arcane Barrier. But for the most part, your pitch cards are there to play through disruption, hit him in the face, go fast, and make him have it. Oh, and Sigil of Solace is a great card. Next on the list, I've got Rhinar. Rhinar also feels like a very good matchup. I feel like it's a common theme with some of these decks where on Azalea doesn't have any like crazy, this card is busted, if I draw it, I have a nasty turn. Rain Razors is the closest, but that takes some setup oftentimes and also involves comboing with other specific cards. But then you have decks like Fi where they find their Art of War, they can have nasty turns that you just can't deal with. And that's where we get to Rhinar, where Rhinar has Bloodrush Bellows. The Azalea Rhinar matchup often feels like, how good are their Bloodrush Bellows? They have to be very good and uninterrupted, I think, for Rhinar to do well in the matchup. If we just take the turn over turn, ignoring if Bloodrush is out of the equation, your turn over turn is just better than Rhinar's, and you will out mid-range him, and you're going to win. The wild card is, does that incremental value you get on normal turns outweigh the value he gets on his Bloodrush turns? So if he finds them all early, chains them together, has them go real well, threatens 20 plus damage on each of them, you're probably not winning that game. But if they're spaced out far enough and you are able to get a health advantage, put him on the back foot, maybe line up a sleep dart or a fatigue shot going into his blood rush turn, or even a red in the ledger or remorseless, like any of those disruptive hits, making his blood rush turns less than perfect, all of a sudden, I think you're very favored in the matchup. So typically normal turn over turn, you're doing very well over Rhinar. I skipped the rating stuff. I'm going to jump back. Rating, I think it's maybe a 6.5 out of 10. Maybe 7. I would say 7, but I've been high rolled by Blood Rush Bells a few too many times to say that it's like super favored. So I'm going to go with like 6.5. Difficulty is probably like a 4 or a 5. It's not the hardest matchup to navigate, but it is something that you do need to there is some level of recognizing if they try and pivot to fatigue you, because Reinhardt does have a ton of 3 blocks, and if we just play turn over turn, and he decides to just block, you can run out of cards. It doesn't happen very often, but just be cognizant of it. You do want to present disruption, obviously, for those blood rush turns. If you can line those up, you're going to be having a great time. So one thing to note is, I've said in the past, decks with on hits, we play Perch Grapplers. Decks without on hits, we play Snaps. This one, I think, is kind of the exception because, as I mentioned, it's going to come down to how those blood rush turns go. Turn over turn, we just do better than him. It's just those spike turns. And having 2 extra health, I've felt, is important for living through those spike turns. In order to extend the game, it gives you ever so slightly more time during the game in order for your turnover turn to leverage across the game. Your turnover turn is a small increment. If you get an extra turn, you get a little bit extra advantage, and I feel like that Perch Grapplers end up being very effective at doing that, or rather more effective than Snaps. There are also games where Reinhardt's running really hot with those blood rushes and everything, and you get put on the back foot and you don't get an opportunity to have a big Snapdragon's turn. So I think it's close, but I'm leaning Perch Grapplers in the matchup. You'll notice that the cards sided out are Memorials and That All You Gots. Memorials just are a non-block. We don't need that. We really don't need non-blocks against Rhinar. Sigils are just too good when you do have tempo. And there's also cheeky things you can do with them at other points. Being able to just... It's such a good card to Arsenal, and then have them take damage to CNC you back. I've lived through a reckless swing with a Sigil of Solace where I knew I had one more and I had to dig into my deck to find it to live through reckless swing because I got put to 1. The card is just very powerful. Obviously, it's not great if everything else gets intimidated out of your hand, but Rain Razors is the only non-block we can really afford to run. Sigil of Solace isn't quite a non-block because it still does heal 3. Fatigue Shot's a pretty powerful tool because obviously all of his attacks are pretty tall. Being able to just throw a Fatigue Shot often puts him into the position where he has to block. Doesn't even need to be dominated, it just slows him down. And that's kind of what you're looking to do. As far as that fatigue thing that I was talking about, is you do have to be a little bit careful of him blocking you out because you're playing such a mid-range tempo game plan that you can find yourself where you didn't connect those big enough turns. Your Rain Razors didn't line up quite right with Bolton shots. Your glides didn't find dominates. And all of a sudden you've fallen behind on pacing. And now you kind of have to pivot into forcing damage through. And that's not the end of the world. You can do it as long as you notice early enough. Yeah, so that's basically the Rhinar matchup. Summarized as don't get high rolled by Blood Rush Bellows. don't accidentally get fatigued. And just play Flesh and Blood. Next one is Bravo. Bravo is slightly similar boat. As I've been playing it more, I may actually take out one of the Memorial Grounds into Bravo. I don't think Bravo can effectively block you out as well as I thought he might have been able to. And similar to Reinar, having this be a non-block is kind of a liability. And I don't think Bravo can fatigue you traditionally by blocking out. The way he fatigues you is having so much pressure that you have to block with cards. But typically Memorial Ground is something you use to leverage a health lead in order to make sure you push through damage. And it feels like it's kind of hard to maintain that health lead. So I think moving forward, I'm not going to play the Memorials into Bravo. But that's something I'll need to test a bit more. That said, matchup rating for Bravo, I would put this probably at like a 4. It's definitely unfavored, not by a ton, but it's a slight unfavor. The difficulty is, again, probably middle of the pack. There's being able to be aware of how much flexibility you have as far as playing tempo or playing that mid-range plan, and how much you can pay attention to fatigue, like what space you have in order to pivot game plans, because Bravo's very good at setting the pace of the game. At times, even if you recognize, hey, I need to make sure that I'm using my cards more efficiently to make sure I can kill him before I run out of cards, you can recognize that, but he's not giving you that option. If he throws a raw crippling crush at you, you don't get to say, no, I'm not. I'm just going to hold on to this card. Like, you get forced into a position where you don't get to choose how you use that card. It's block with it or discard it. So you get a little bit less agency in the matchup, and it's going to come down to a bit of variance there on how things line up. Same thing with like Terra Sunders. But Terra Sunder in particular is one where it's very important to try and get D-Reacts in Arsenal when you can. This matchup's gotten a lot harder since I changed sigils, or changed take covers over to sigil, because the 0 for 4 D-Reacts are incredibly powerful into Bravo. If you have a lot of Bravos in your meta, there might be a consideration to try and sneak them back into the list. Sigil is probably where it goes. It would be Bravos and Dories are where you really want them. But as far as a more balanced meta, I think Sigil of Solace is better. But yeah, in the matchup, you want to get those D-Reacts in Arsenal, because a D-React in Arsenal gets you out of Spinal Crush with a 2 or 3 block from hand, typically a 3 block. Gets you out of Terra Sunder with a 3 block from hand. Gets you out of Crippling Crush, Dominate, with either another D-React in hand or a 2 or 3 block plus your Perch Grapplers. And that's typically where you're going to want to commit your Perch Grapplers, is like a Dominated Crippling Crush with a Fate Foreseen block, at which point these Perch Grapplers translate, in that given situation, the Perch Grappler block translates to like 8 or 9 value. It's something crazy, because it's 2 health and 2 full cards, and a card is worth 3 to 4. So yeah, I'm going to call it 8 to 9 value off these, if you can line that up, where you have the D-React in Arsenal. So you really want to hold Perch Grapplers when you can, because that, if you're able to block a Dominated Crippling Crush, it is a massive tempo swing, and you probably end up winning the game from that point, because you'll typically use 2 cards to stop their 4 cards, and I guess you still leak 3, but regardless, it's very big if you can do that. Notable cards in the matchup. Red in the Ledger is quite good. If they're on the back foot, Red in the Ledger isn't quite as good. Red in the Ledger is better when they're on the front foot, because it stops them from dominating. If they're on the back foot, they're already fine with throwing something out without dominate, because they already needed to block. They couldn't afford the resources to dominate. Now, if they're on the front foot, yeah, no. Back foot red and ledger isn't as good. If they're on the back foot, I think fatigue shot gets a little bit better. The only problem with fatigue shot is it also has additional text that says they get a tear asunder that magically appears in their hand whenever you dominate the fatigue shot. Or at least I think that's what it says on the card. That's what happens whenever I fire it. Yeah, fatigue shot's great until they have tear asunder. But if they don't have tear asunder, it's a little rough. Fatigue shot is also very fun paired with a dominate and seek and destroy, because if they have like a crippling in arsenal that they were trying to find a window for, they now have to cast it for 6 or just not cast it and lose it. So fatigue shot can be very good in that option, or in that way. But overall, it's going to be a mid-range game plan. You don't have quite as much space to take inefficient lines as you might like, because Bravo doesn't give you a lot of space. He's very aggressive. If he wants to play defensive and block, you may be able to find that space, but oftentimes they're just going to run at you, and you kind of need to stave them off while trying to be as efficient as possible. Yeah, I think that's the main thing. Hopefully have a D-React in Arsenal for a tear asunder or a crippling. Puts you in a really strong position, or like any big dominated attack. Yeah, that's about it. Next is, let's go into Dorinthia. Dorinthia is a strange one. So I run 74 into Dorinthia, not because it's the matchup where it's like you're most afraid of fatigue. You are afraid of fatigue, actually pretty afraid, but it's not the most one. The reason is that every card in the deck has a role into Dorinthia. Like, into Oldhim, that all you got doesn't really have a good place, which is why it comes out, but this is perfectly fine into Dorinthia. D-Reacts are very powerful against Dorinthia. So I'm very happy to have these. And everything else serves its purpose well. Now, Dorinthia is a strange one because, well, I guess we'll jump into the rating. I think this matchup is slightly favored as well. I feel like I keep using it, but it's about a 6 out of 10. Most of the things outside of Oldhim and Dromai are going to be, I think, at least like close to either slightly unfavored or slightly favored. This one might be a little more favored. Or rather, sorry, like the Rhinar and like Dash might be a little more favored, but most of them are pretty close to where it's going to come down to how well it's piloted a lot of times. As far as matchup difficulty, I would say that this is one of the more difficult matchups to navigate. A lot of that comes to the burden of knowledge that Dorinthia puts on a player in general, in addition to the difficulty of navigating Azalea through that, where you have to be very careful with what you're blocking with and how you're using your resources, because if Dorinthia is like snowballing, she's going to force cards out of your hand to try and slow her down and get it under control. And you'll be blocking with cards that you may not have actually wanted to block with. And then she can pivot straight into a fatigue plan, because a lot of them are running like 90 reacts and Oasis Respites. I guess if we count Oasis as it's like 12. And they play them off Tunic, and they're able to just threaten a little bit here and there. Whenever you give them any space, they're demanding cards, and they can fatigue you pretty effectively if you're not careful. Again, I feel like that's always the caveat with Azalea getting fatigued. Outside of Oldhim, is it's something that you're prone to if you're not careful about, or careful to avoid, but it is avoidable. So into Dorinthia, you have to be very cognizant of what you're blocking with. You have to be making sure to maintain those threats in deck while also not letting it snowball out of control. So it's very much so played by feel. If based on the pacing, if they're trading damage, you don't have to worry about what you're blocking with. If they're blocking a lot, now you have to be careful with what you block with. And you have to be constantly assessing how the matchup is progressing. Now, that said, I think Dory's, like, the main way that I end up losing to Dory's is going to be them snowballing. And I think anyone can lose to Dory. We have a lot of, like, non-blocks that can be scary, or 2 blocks, when all of a sudden they go into, like, a Glistening, Iron Song, Warrior's Valor turn or something like that, that all of a sudden they get, like, 3 counters, and you draw up a hand, and your hand blocks 8 on the falling one, and they've got 3 counters. And you go, uh-oh. I think I die. So obviously we don't want to get to that point, but sometimes that happens. On the other games where they just have normal Dory turns, you know, swing in Dawnblade for 6 to 9, giving it go again into another 3 or something, that's much more manageable, and we can win those turn over turn. Because our damage is just a lot more efficient, and we have the 9 of D-Reacts. We've got Disruption in the form of Red in the Ledger and Sleep Dart that stop those wider turns. And as long as you try and keep the Dawnblade under control, you shouldn't have too many issues there. But again, just be aware of the potential for fatigue. There are a couple fun interactions that I really like in the matchup. Actually, there's just one in particular that I really enjoy. And that's Seek and Destroy. Sorry. That's Seek and Destroy, which is... Sorry, I got distracted by Discord. Seek and Destroy. When you hit that on a Dory, oftentimes, occasionally, if it's like not dominated and they let it hit, you know, let's just say Remorseless for 8 with a Seek and Destroy on it. All of a sudden they let it hit and they go, I'm going to crack back with a 5-card hand. And they go Steelblade Supremacy and then start playing out cards. Now, if Dory doesn't have a Dawnblade counter at this point, and your hand doesn't have like multiple reacts, there's a very strong argument to just say no blocks. Like, I know that sounds crazy for everyone who's played against Dorinthia. They play Steelblade Supremacy. You start throwing your hand in front. That's just what you do. But the thing is, when they're under Seek and Destroy, they have to play out all their cards. And there's a lot of cards in their deck that require Reprise to be effective. Whether that's Glint the Quicksilver, whether that's Iron Song Response, Singing Steelblade. If they have any of those cards in their hand, and you just don't block, they just get discarded at the end. So let's just take the hypothetical scenario where they're going into a Steelblade Supremacy turn, and they have a Singing Steelblade in hand, and they have an Iron Song Response on the top of their deck. Let's just say where they'd end up drawing it. If they come in for 5, and you threw 9 in front, they might still be able to get over it. And then you're still going to take a little, and then you're going to take some on the next thing. You've thrown 9 in front, and they got over with their Iron Song and their Singing Steelblade and all that stuff. Or their Glint drew them a card. If you just say no blocks, all 3 of those cards basically do nothing. So you're holding your 3 cards back. You're obviously taking the damage for not blocking with them, but they're not getting any value out of their cards and they have to discard it. They're also going to be drawing into cards off of Steelblade Supremacy, which means if they draw into any of those, they're just like pitch fodder at that point. And there's not much for them to do with it. So oftentimes it'll involve giving them a counter, but you get to hold your 5-card hand and know that they come into the next turn with a 4-card hand. So again, it comes down to the situation, the game state and all that, but it's something to be aware of, that if they're under Seek and Destroy, no blocks is a very strong option at times. I think my favorite. I think I got a singing +2 Red Iron Song response one time off that line. Uh, they couldn't do anything with them. They weren't playable. And if I blocked for 3, I would have taken an extra like 10 damage, or I would have taken an 6 more and lost my 3 block essentially. Like they would have gotten 9 extra value. So it's a bit of a gamble. The other thing that kind of ties into that with the whole fatigue conversation that I was having is that the conversation with the fatigue thing that I was having is that if you give them that counter there and then you crack back with a 5-card hand, that Dory, whether or not they realize it or whether or not they should, they're incentivized by the fact that they have a counter on their Dawnblade. So they want to hold cards to try and crack or swing that Dawnblade. So now they had a 4-card hand and they have a counter. If you represent like 12, 15 damage, they're like, I only want to block with maybe 1 or 2 cards. And now they're leaking a bunch of damage to try and keep that Dawnblade counter. Or the alternative is they throw their entire hand in front and they lose the counter and it didn't actually matter that they got it. But oftentimes they'll find them trying to leak some damage in order to keep that counter. And then maybe they block 6, take 9 on that line, and you just throw cards in front, clear the counter, reset the turn cycle, and they've come out pretty far behind because they had to hold a 5-card hand on the previous one that they got Seek and Destroyed on. So being cognizant of that is very important. But yeah, that's the biggest interaction with the Seek and Destroy that I'm a big fan of. Next one is going to be Dromai. Now, Dromai sucks. This, I wasn't sure at first, but I've come to think that it's my worst our worst matchup. It feels real bad. I'm toying around with a slightly different version that's added in poppers and 2 extra red Ravels, and I think it helps, and I think it's probably what I'm going to run because I'm in a very Dromai heavy meta. But I'll probably post that list somewhere. But this original list was basically on the game plan of I get a lunch break because I just can scoop to the Dromai. Obviously not seriously, I'm not actually scooping to them, but it feels almost that bad. It's just, yeah, real rough. That said, there are games that you can win against Dromai, and typically those are going to follow something along the lines of early game, having some decent pressure with maybe some dominates or just wide turns, as well as finding opportunities to use like Ravenous Rebels, Bolton Shots, and E-Strikes to clear early dragons that are going to be accumulating too much value over the game if you don't deal with them. As you transition a little bit to where they get to maybe 15, 20 health, that's where you then need to look at ignoring dragons past that point, to where you need to just be representing big numbers at their face and hopefully dominating things like Red in the Ledger and Sleep Dart to slow them down. But once they get down to a certain health, again, probably in the 15, 20 health, you kind of just need to ignore dragons and try and just lunge across the finish line, so to speak. It's not great. Matchup still sucks, but that's kind of the most successful game plan I've found. That's all I got. We're playing incredibly aggressive. Any opportunity we have to trade damage, we're going to want to trade damage, and we don't want to throw cards in front unless we absolutely have to. And the last one is Dash. I saved it for last because Dash is a very... Oh, sorry. Dory, or Dromai. Matchup rating 2, and matchup difficulty is probably like a 4. It's not that complicated, I don't think. And I don't know, maybe I just haven't put in the reps to recognize where I could be improving, but it doesn't feel like it's anything crazy. Dash. Dash I think is a very good matchup for us. probably one of our better meta matchups because we have the tools to deal with all of her game plans, some more than others. And we're able to sideboard in a way that we don't get particularly punished by what version she ends up playing. So there's a handful of versions of Dash running around. You've got, it's almost like on a spectrum from full on hyper aggro, which would be like your Hanabi Blaster plus either Hyperdriver or Pounder, where they're just full boosting, going for max velocities and all that stuff. You've got that end of the spectrum, all the way to the other side, which is like Jacob Bau's Tree Frog list, where you've got healing in there, you've got way too many D-reacts, you've got everything known to man for stalling the game. Just going long until they can get their pistols set up. And I think those two ends of the spectrum are probably the hardest matchups for Azalea as far as Dash matchups. But I guess I'll kind of categorize them as it's like 4 different categories. You have the hyper aggro, you've got kind of the mid-range, which would be probably like a pistol plan that isn't running D-reacts or very few D-reacts. And then you've got kind of the traditional control that's going to be on the pistol plan, but with more D-reacts and maybe like unmovables and stuff. And then you've got like the Tree Frog. Mid-range, I think, is our easiest matchup. They don't defend well enough to get their pistol plan set up, and they don't play efficiently enough on the boost plan to race us down. They kind of just do neither particularly well. Next one over is like the traditional control, which I also think we have a good matchup into. However, we need to be a lot more aggressive into it just to make sure that they don't have time to get all their pistol stuff set up. The kind of Tree Frog is a similar case where you need to be as aggressive as possible in order to make sure that they don't get that end game set up and you don't give them space to play out like their healing stuff or whatever they're trying to do. Just hit them in the face, go fast. And I think it's a good matchup, but I'm not 100% sure. Then, yeah, and then back on the first side, the hyper aggro, that one's actually kind of scary because we do still have non-blocks in the deck, but if you're careful and try and block efficiently, and you may be able to fatigue them. There might just be too many 2-blocks though, so I'm not 100% sure. You're definitely looking to find opportunities to threaten things like the Red and the Ledgers and the Remorselesses, but that's a game where it's going to come down to pacing again, where you have to recognize how slow the game is going. But it's one of those rare matchups where that pacing is on the other side, where we can actually fatigue the full aggro Dash, as opposed to us being the one getting fatigued. So just, yeah, and that's one where if they run really hot, they can kill us, which I guess feels like a common theme when talking about the Azalea matchups, is I feel like our turn over turn, like our average turn against a lot of decks is better. The problem is they have bigger spike turns. So if they get enough big spike turns and we don't, or rather they just hit them, because like we don't have crazy spike turns really. Our turns are pretty consistent. If they get those big spike turns, that's how we lose those games. And so matchups where the game goes longer is good for us because that variance kind of balances out better, as opposed to the hyper aggro Dash that game's over in 4 turns, one person's losing. If we brick a hand in there, we just lose the game. Whereas opposed to a game that goes 10 turns, sure, you're more likely to hit 1 brick in there, but you can still win after 1 brick in there. So that's roughly where I'd put the Dash matchup. And I think that's all I'm going to cover in the meta matchups. Actually, I can touch on Lexi briefly. Lexi, I'm still not 100% sure the best way to approach the matchup. It's one I haven't gotten enough testing into that, yeah, it's not as much as I'd like. But currently what I'm trying is a very defensive game plan, which I think Lexi often forces you into in all of her, obviously, like, ice effects. We can't play through Blizzard Bolts. We can't really play through Chilling Ice Veins. We get forced to just lay our hand down until she stumbles. And so the way that I have it sideboard is I took out all the non-blocks except for sigils, the release the tensions, the take aims, that all you got, because these get messed up by a frostbite. And the plan is just block efficiently until she lets you keep a card or two, fire back something simple. Maybe block with 3 cards, arsenal something like a red in the ledger, block with 4 cards, tunic, fire red in the ledger. And just get that small disruption in there. And whenever she stumbles or slows down and gives you a window, you still have the tools in the deck to threaten her. But you can't afford, or you can't play through her disruption to the point where you're consistently the aggressor, which is why a lot of these 2 blocks and non-blocks have come out. Rain Razors felt particularly bad in the matchup. It's the only matchup where I take it out, but Lexi is too often able to force you to block with your entire hand. That it being a non-block was too much of a liability. I think that's it for most of the main meta matchups. I'm gonna skip over Katsu, Kano. Viserai actually is very close to Fi. Just run at him, because he likes his 5-card hands. Don't let him have it, and we can't block him out. That's my quick Viserai. And I think that matchup is a lot better than the Fi matchup, because I think Viserai, yeah, I think the Viserai matchup is quite good. Probably like a 6 or maybe even a 7. Arachne, you shouldn't be playing against Arachnes, but if you are, just be aware of fatigue starting turn 0 and play somewhat mid-range. Look for forcing damage whenever possible. That's when you should probably practice if you are expecting Arachnes, but overall, I think the matchup is very good for us with practice. Levi, I don't have enough reps into Levi to have a great answer. Bolton, I don't have enough reps in to give a great answer. Mirror match is kind of toxic. Yeah, mirror match is toxic. That's all I got for that. And I'm skipping Kano and Katsu. Yeah, hopefully that helps. If anyone has specific questions on one of those other matchups I glossed over, feel free to message me. I've got some experience. I'm just, again, not the most confident in what I've found on those, so I don't want to toss it in here. I also don't think that they're the most relevant for the ProQuest season. I don't think you're going to see a ton of those. So, yeah, that's what I got. Hopefully this was helpful. I'm hoping to record Fi and Icelander VOD reviews soon. I've been procrastinating a bit more than I'd like, and ProQuest season is starting soon. So, oh, and I gotta record Reiner as well. And I can only record like 1 a day because my voice gets shot. But, all right. Thanks for watching. I will call it there.